Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. So today's webinar is our 9th one in our series of 10 Code Total HR webinars that we're doing. And today we're going to be talking about how to manage sickness and absence. Now, it's such a common query that we get on the helpline, so we're going to have a slightly shorter presentation today, around about 30 minutes. And what that will do, it will give us a longer time for a question and answer session at the end, because we're anticipating there's going to be quite a few questions that come through. So firstly then, to quickly introduce myself, my name's Hannah and I'm one of the HR advisors here within the Code team. So we're just going to have a quick look at the aims and objectives of today's session. So the aim of today's session is to increase your understanding of how to effectively manage sickness absence and to help you comply with employment legislation. The objectives of today's session are to discuss an overview of the law relating to sickness absence, to highlight the risks of failing to follow a fair sickness absence management process, and to explore how Code Total HR provides useful policies and template letters to help you comply with your legal obligations. Now, the learning outcomes from today's session will be to avoid potentially costly mistakes relating to discrimination, to improve your understanding of the benefits of completing effective return to work interviews, and to understand how the legislation relating to sickness absence in a bit more detail. So in order to achieve all these aims, objectives and learning outcomes, what we're going to go through. So we're going to talk about the different types of sickness absence and the duties for both an employer and an employee. We're also going to talk about how to prevent sickness absence, how to effectively complete return to work interviews, how to manage sickness absence, how to fairly dismiss an employee on the grounds of sickness absence, and how to minimise the risks of an employment tribunal and other potential claims. So firstly then, let's have a look at the different types of sickness absence. So the first type of absence is your short-term absence. Now, from speaking to practices, we find this is the most disruptive type of absence. It's usually unplanned, so it can be difficult for you to manage and difficult for you to obtain cover for. Now, another type of absence is your long-term absence. Now, this is usually absence over 4 weeks. Now, for short-term absence, we find the most common reasons we get calls on the helpline are for illnesses like your sickness diarrhoea, headache migraine, cough, cold, flu, those types of absences. Now, for your long-term absence, the most common reasons we receive calls about are your mental health-related problems, but also as well musculoskeletal, potentially back problems. Now, as an employer, you're required to pay statutory sick pay to your team members who qualify for that. So the qualifying criteria is dependent upon their earnings. There is a minimum earnings threshold, but also dependent upon the number of days. So a team member has to be off sick for 4 days to qualify for statutory sick pay. Now, if they do qualify for statutory sick pay, they're entitled to up to 28 weeks statutory sick pay to be paid to them. Now, we know a lot of our practices also offer enhanced sick pay. Now, that's a really good benefit to retain your existing employees, but also as a part of a recruitment process, it can be a really enticing package there. So we know recruitment is difficult at the moment, so we know a lot of practices are offering this. Now, if you do offer enhanced sick pay, it's normally detailed within the employee's terms and conditions of employment, and you're required to pay that to them in accordance with the terms of their contract. As an employee, though, they're required to notify you of their absence, and those notification procedures should be detailed within their contract, within their sickness absence policy, or potentially within both. Now, we recommend that you ask team members to call you to notify you of their absence. That then provides you with the opportunity to have a bit more of a discussion with them and find out a few more details. So we'd recommend avoiding the use of emails, text messages, WhatsApp groups to notify their absence, particularly with your WhatsApp groups. There could be a potential breach of GDPR if you're asking them for more details through that group. Now, we've put together a list of the most common impacts that we talk to practice owners and practice managers about in regards to sickness absence. Now, the first one has got to be the cost of that sickness absence. Now, that's not just the cost of paying statutory sick pay or enhanced sick pay to your team members. That's also the cost of cover, so potential overtime for other employees who are covering that absence, or potentially even agency workers, which we know can be really expensive. But also another impact that we find really common is the morale of other team members. So your other team members who are potentially working extra, who are potentially more stressed because they have that additional workload, their morale can sometimes drop. Now, on a long-term basis, if they are feeling particularly stressed, for instance, that could result in them taking time off work. Or again, if they feel that situation isn't being managed, they may even consider leaving the practice due to that drop in morale. But also, if your team members have additional workload, they may not be as effective in their role. They may not be as productive, and that can potentially have a knock-on effect to your patient experience and even your practice reputation. But also another impact that we find is in relation to your CQC inspection, and in particular the well-led section of the inspection. So a CQC inspector may look to see that you are managing sickness absence within the practice as part of that. Now, one of the things we really focus on here within the Code Total HR team is prevention. So prevention rather than cure. And there are a number of different things that we can recommend to help you sort of prevent and manage sickness absence. So the first one is policies. Now, that's not just your sort of contract of employment with your employees, so have those notification procedures in that and your sickness absence policy. But also in your sickness absence policy, you should have a procedure detailed of how you will deal with sickness absence if it becomes sort of an issue within the practice. Now, in addition to that, it's also really important to have a capability policy in place within a practice. Now, if you dismiss an employee on the grounds of ill health, that falls under one of the 5 fair reasons for dismissal, and that's the capability reason. So it's really important that you have that capability policy in place within your practice, because that almost works in conjunction with your sickness absence policy to help you manage that. Another way that you can sort of manage sickness absence is by training your line managers. So train your line managers on how they should be, how you want them to be dealing with sickness absence. And we get quite a lot of calls from practice managers, practice owners who have never had a sickness absence problem within their practice. They've never managed it. But that makes it slightly more difficult when you do have a problem because you don't have the framework, you don't have the audit trail to be able to escalate that to a formal stage. And medical questionnaires, they're another way that you can support your employees. So providing your employees with a medical questionnaire to complete will help you identify any medical conditions they have and any potential reasonable adjustments you need to make to be able to allow that employee to fulfil that role to the best of their ability. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot throughout today's presentation about sort of reasonable adjustments because they're such a key part of a sickness absence procedure to make those reasonable adjustments for an employee, and that's potentially something your tribunal will look for. Now, there are lots of different types of reasonable adjustments you can make, and there's lots of different ways you can manage those within your practice. Now, for a bit more information on reasonable adjustments, go onto our website, have a look at the previous webinars we held. The last one was about reasonable adjustments. There'll be a bit more information there for you. A common myth that we receive calls about on the helpline is whether you can issue these medical questionnaires as part of a recruitment process. That's not something we would recommend. If you're making decisions as part of a recruitment process based on any medical conditions, there could be a strong claim for discrimination there. So we'd recommend you avoid issuing them prior to offering a role to employee. So only give that medical questionnaire to an employee once you've formally issued that role to them. Another way you can help manage sickness absence is through the use of fit notes. So all employees are required to provide their employer with a fit note after being absent for more than 7 calendar days. So that is a requirement for all employees. Now, by having to go to your GP to obtain that fit note, that gives the employee the opportunity to seek some medical advice, seek some support from their GP as well. However, it also helps to deter non-genuine absence because they have to go to the GP and they have to get that note for you. Now, in terms of non-genuine absence, if you have the evidence and the audit trail to be able to prove that that absence isn't genuine, that's more of a conduct issue. So rather than deal with it under the sickness absence procedure, it's potentially more appropriate to deal with that under a disciplinary procedure. And again, for a bit more information on the disciplinary procedure, have a look on our website. The very first webinar we held in the series was all on the disciplinary procedure. Return to work interviews. They're also another way to manage your sickness absence, and again, they help to prevent non-genuine absence. If your employees know that upon returning from work after an absence, they're going to have a return to work interview with their line manager, that will help you to deter that non-genuine absence. Now, for our total HR members, we can also support you with completing a stress audit within the practice. So that will help you identify any triggers and put any support measures in place for employees who potentially are experiencing stress. Now, another really good way to manage sickness absence within the practice is by keeping in regular contact with your employees, having that communication method. Now, communication can vary depending on each individual, depending on their reason for absence and the length of their absence. So, for instance, if you've got a team member that's just off for a couple of days, you may want to ask them to call in every day to notify you if you're absent. However, if you've got a team member who potentially has been signed off sick for a couple of weeks, you may want to arrange a weekly phone call with them to find out how they're doing. So it's really gauging that and agreeing that with each team member. Now, to give you an example, a couple of months ago, we helped a practice owner who'd called us. Just because the role of a practice owner is so busy, he'd completely forgotten about a team member who'd been off on long-term sick for around about 12 months, and they hadn't been in contact for about 9 months. So what we recommended in this situation is that they give them a call, find out how they're doing, keep the conversation really light, and just generally get a bit of background information. But from initially having that first phone call, within about 6 weeks, that team member had returned to work. So by having that communication, it supports that team member in returning to work and also helps them feel valued. Another common query we get on the helpline is about work-related stress and whether you're able to contact an employee who is absent due to work-related stress, who's potentially been signed off by their doctor. Yeah, absolutely, you can do. You can contact them because by having that contact, it makes them feel valued and you can support them in returning to work. However, you do need to be mindful of their reasons for their absence. So take into consideration how they're feeling. You may need to make reasonable adjustments in terms of how you contact them, the method and the frequency, but by having that communication with them, that'll help support them. They'll be able to see that you're making changes within the practice to help reduce that stress that they're feeling, so they're more likely to return to work. Now, in an ideal world, all your employees would contact you every time they were absent. However, in reality, that doesn't always happen. And you may find yourself in the situation where a team member hasn't contacted you to notify if they're absent, and you haven't agreed any pre-arranged leave with them. In this situation, they would be considered AWOL, so absence without leave. Now, first of all, your priority has got to be to establish their welfare. Are they okay? Has anything happened to them? So try and give them a call, try and contact them to check that they're okay. You may need to consider using their emergency contact details to try and check their welfare. Or potentially you may also want to have a look on their social media accounts. Have they updated them at all? But as I mentioned, your priority has got to be to check their welfare. And it may be that you need to use a number of different communication methods, so potentially emailing them, writing letters to them, to almost build that audit trail. Now, unfortunately, if you find yourselves in a situation where you've tried to contact them a number of times by a number of different methods and you've still not had any response from them, you may need to look to escalate that procedure. Now, in terms of escalation, there's potentially a number of different routes you could take. So it could be potentially a disciplinary process, it could be a sickness absence process, and that depends upon a number of factors. It depends upon sort of anything that happened within the practice prior to them leaving, anything they've got going on in their personal lives, anything you've potentially seen on social media. So if you find yourself in that situation, would recommend that you seek some further advice, potentially give us a call on the helpline. We can talk that situation through with you and establish what's the most appropriate method to follow in the situation. Now, I mentioned earlier about return to work interviews being such a key way of managing sickness absence within the practice, and I can't stress enough how important they are as part of an informal sickness absence management process. Now, it's really important prior to holding a return to work interview with a team member that you prepare. So you prepare what you want to say to them, any points you want to raise to them, so you can have a really productive meeting. Now, during that return to work meeting, it's the opportunity for you to update the employee on anything that's happened within the practice while they're absent, but also the employee's opportunity to update you on their medical conditions, talk to you about anything confidential, anything that potentially you should be aware of. That's why it's really important to have that meeting within a confidential one-to-one environment so they feel able to disclose that information to you. But it's also important to remember that actually you need to assess whether that team member is fit to return to work. So particularly for your nurses that complete sort of clinical procedures, you need to assess whether they're actually fit to practice on your patients. Are they well enough to return to work, or have they potentially returned to work a bit too soon? So we recommend that you hold those return to work interviews after every single absence. So regardless of whether that's half a day, a couple of weeks, or a couple of months, hold that meeting with them. It will then start to be the expectation in the practice that when you have an absence, you'll have a meeting with your line manager upon your return to work. Now, during that meeting, ask open questions so you can gain maximum information from them, but also listen to any feedback and support them where you need to. Take on board any reasonable adjustments they've requested, and also put them into place where you can. Now, with the return to work interviews, it's really important to document them. So that will help you build your audit trail. So you know if you need to escalate it to a formal stage, you have that audit trail and that framework to be able to support you in doing so. Now, you'll see on screen at the moment, we have the return to work interview form on iComply. So that's available for all our iComply members and our total HR members to use during those return to work interviews. Now, I've mentioned now about it being so important to keep all those records of your return to work interviews, but that's also in addition to keeping all your fit notes, all your information from your GP, any informal discussion notes, your formal meeting notes, any letters you sent to your employees, any GP reports, occupational health reports. It's really important to keep all that information, because if you end up in a situation where a team member is disputing the reason perhaps you've escalated to a formal stage, or worst case scenario, you end up in a tribunal, it's that information that you will rely upon to defend why you've escalated that issue or potentially why you've made that decision as you have, evidencing that to a tribunal that you have followed a fair process when managing that employee. So it's really important to keep all that information and make sure you're holding it confidentially in line with GDPR. Now, you may find yourselves in a situation that you've had a number of informal meetings, a number of return to work interviews, but you've got a sickness absence issue within the practice and you now need to escalate that. Now, there are a number of different sickness absence policies out there that you can use. Today, I'm going to focus on the one we've got on iComply. Now, in our iComply policy, you can escalate the sickness absence to a formal process for a number of reasons. So that could be because the number of absences is having an impact upon the practice. You feel it's potentially excessive. The team member's been off on long-term sick. You're concerned about something they've raised during a return to work interview, or you're concerned about a potential underlying medical health issue. So you can raise that to a formal procedure. However, you need to make sure you're applying those reasons consistently and fairly to all team members within your practice. You're not singling anyone out. Now, within our iComply procedure, there's a number of staged absence meetings. So we've got a 3-stage process. Now, the first stage is where you sit down with the employee, talk about their reasons for absence and agree that action plan moving forward to help improve their attendance. Now, the second stage is where you review that action plan, review any updates. And the third stage is where you may need to consider dismissing that employee due to their ill health. Now, that's a basic 3-stage process. With each individual that you take through a formal sickness absence meeting, it will be different because it will be unique to the reasons for their absence, their length of service, anything else they've got going on. You'll need to take all that into consideration. So it may be that you actually need to have a number of meetings above and beyond that 3-stage process to evidence that you're following a fair process, that you've been reasonable as an employer. Throughout that formal absence process as well, you may also need to consider obtaining a GP report. So again, if you end up in a tribunal situation, a tribunal will look to see that you sought external medical advice before you've made any decisions on the future employment of your employees. So obtain that GP report to give you a bit more medical information. Now, as part of obtaining a GP report, we have a number of forms on iComply that you can use. So we have a employee's consent form, so a form that you can give to the team member to ask them to sign to consent to you obtaining a GP report. We also have a template letter that you can send to the GP. Now, it's quite often you're going to need to adapt that letter so it suits the circumstances, so it suits the absence. So you can almost get the most out of that GP report. Now, for our total HR members, that's something we'll help you do. We'll help support you in writing that letter as well. Another thing you may need to consider is referring that employee to an occupational health for an independent medical assessment. Again, that will give you more external advice to support any decision that you're making. Now, with both the GP report and the occupational health report, you need to obtain that consent from the employee. So that could mean they refuse that consent. Now, if you end up in that situation, it's really important that you've got a good audit trail to evidence that you have asked the team member on a number of occasions to provide you with that consent. You've talked to them about your reasons why. You've tried to alleviate any concerns that you have. So if you end up in a tribunal, you can evidence that and evidence that you've been a fair employer. So we recommend if you end up in that situation, because there are so many different risks with making decisions without medical evidence, recommend you seek some advice to ensure that you've covered all bases there. Now, quite often with a sickness absence process, if you're following a fair process, it can take around 6 to 12 months to follow that process through. Now, for our Total HR members, you may find it really useful to use the Code HR online application that you'll have access to. So as part of that application, on the team member's profile, there's a sickness tab. So you can record in there all the details of their absence. The system will then automatically calculate for you the total number of days absence, the total number of occasions, and if you use the Bradford Factor score, that's also calculated within the system. And you'll see on the screen at the moment, there's also a trends tab, so that automatically calculates for you the trends. So for instance, you can see at the moment, Adele, she's had 50% of her absences on a Friday. So during those formal absence meetings, you can then raise that to the employee. You're not accusing them of anything, you're merely establishing the facts. Is there a reason why they're having absence on a particular day? Is there a pattern? Is there a reason for that? Do you need to support them with that? But by having something like this application in place, it gives you that almost evidence to be able to present to the employee to support your case of why you're raising it to them. Now, once you've gone through a number of informal meetings, a number of formal meetings as well, you may find yourself in the situation that you're considering dismissing that employee. Now, as I mentioned earlier, an ill health dismissal comes under the capability fair reason for dismissal. However, in order for it to be a fair reason for dismissal, you have to have followed a fair process. Now, as part of it being a fair process, dismissal on the grounds of ill health must be a last resort. You must have looked at all other alternative options, all reasonable adjustments available to that team member. And if you end up in a tribunal situation, that may be something they ask you to evidence, that you have looked into all options and you have no other alternative within the practice. Now, during not just the dismissal meeting, but all the formal meetings, the team members have the right to be accompanied. Now, they have the right to be accompanied by either a work colleague or a trade union representative. However, there have been lots of case law recently where employers have lost at a tribunal because it's been deemed unreasonable, that they've refused to allow the employee to be accompanied by someone outside of the fellow colleague or trade union representative bracket. So we'd recommend, if you're ever in the situation that you have had a request to be accompanied by someone else and you're considering refusing that request, you seek advice because of this case law that's recently come out from lots of different employers. Now, notice pay. If you dismiss a team member on the grounds of ill health, they're entitled to notice pay in accordance with their contract of employment. Now, for your team members that are having regular short-term absence, would recommend that you pay this notice to them in lieu, so you don't ask them to work their notice. Now, if you do, it's quite likely that their morale is going to be low, that they are going to be disruptive within the practice, so it's quite often going to be difficult to have them in there. It's not going to be conducive, so we'd recommend you pay it to them in lieu. Now, for your employees that are off on long-term sickness, it's important to remember that during that period of long-term sickness, they still accrue holiday, so you'll be required to pay that holiday accrual to them in their final salary. Now, team members are also entitled to a written outcome. So a written outcome for confirming that dismissal and confirming the decision that you have made. Now, within that written outcome, it should detail their line of appeal. Now, ideally with that appeal, it should be impartial, but we know for our small practices that can be really difficult. If you've only got a practice owner, practice manager that have already been involved in the case, it can be really difficult. So particularly for your dismissals, you may want to consider seeking external support to be able to help you with that. So again, I would recommend if you're in the situation where particularly you've dismissed an employee and you are offering them the line of appeal, potentially even they have appealed, and you're concerned that you're not having someone impartial, seek some advice. Perhaps give us a call on the helpline. We can guide you through almost how to mitigate your risk there. Now, with an appeal and with the right to be accompanied, this is two of the most common reasons that employers get stung at a tribunal, by forgetting to allow them the right to be accompanied and forgetting them to allow them the right to appeal. So it's really important to try and remember those two things where you can. Now, I've mentioned throughout the last few slides about lots of risks with a sickness absence procedure, and that's really because there are such close links with the Equality Act 2010. So particularly two of your big risks are a disability discrimination claim and an age discrimination claim. Now, your age discrimination claim might be more relevant for your older workers who you're going through this process with. Now, with your age discrimination and your disability discrimination claims, Your employees don't have to have any length of service to be able to claim this. They can claim this right from day one, and even as part of a recruitment process before they've been employed, they can claim discrimination. And a payout for discrimination is also unlimited. There is no cap on the amount that could be. So there's a real risk there. But also with your unfair dismissal claims. So if you have an employee with over 2 years service, if you fail to follow the ACAS guidelines, there may be a claim for unfair dismissal. There's also potential claims for personal injury, criminal convictions, negligence claim for breach of health and safety. Now, as an employer, you have a duty to protect not just the physical, but also the mental health and safety of your employees. So that's potentially where your risks are for a maybe mental health condition. But as I mentioned earlier, there's also risks from your employees who are covering, who are covering for that absence of a team member. If that goes on long term, if they're feeling stressed for quite some time, they've got an additional workload, they may raise a grievance against the practice. Now, a grievance can quite often take a number of months to resolve in addition to managing that sickness absence process. So that can be quite time consuming, and also that's likely to result in a drop in morale within the practice. And again, that could have a knock-on effect to your patient experience and your practice reputation. There's also the risk of the cost as well involved that we spoke about earlier. Now, in order to mitigate these risks, we have a number of different policies on iComply and template letters that you can use to help support you through that process. But also for our Total HR members, we'll be able to provide you with bespoke letters. So for instance, that could be formal invites to the sickness absence meetings. We'll help support you in writing those. Now, a number of recommended actions for next week. So recommend you check your sickness absence policies up to date, as well as your capability policy and procedure. So perhaps compare them to the ones we've got on iComply. Check they've all been issued to your team members as well, and you've got signed copies from all your employees on file. But also review your sickness absence management system. Have you got one in place? Do you need to update it? Have a look into that within the practice. Start doing return to work interviews as well if you're not already. And also train your line managers so they're able to deal with sickness absence more effectively. Communicate your expectations to all staff. So your expectations in terms of notifying absence, but also how you'll manage that absence as well. So to make you aware, there's some current employment law updates that are due to be released next month. So on the 6th of April 2019, statutory sick pay is going to increase. So it's going to increase from £92.05 per week to £94.25 per week. So you'll need to implement that within your practice. There are also a number of other statutory pay increases that are due to come out at the beginning of next month. So have a look out for our newsletter that we're currently complying, and some recent documents that are soon going to be released on iComply. That'll give you a bit more information about those changes that are upcoming. Now here, one of the things within the Total HR team we do is not just keep up to date with all legislation so we can pass that on to you. As part of the Total HR service, you'll also receive personal support with the setup of your staff handbook and contracts for your practice. So that will include your sickness absence policy, your capability policies, and those notification clauses within your contracts as well. We'll also be able to provide you with those advanced HR templates. So that's the things like your stress audits and your bespoke letters as well. We'll also review your contracts and your HR documentation on an annual basis to ensure that if there's been any updates in legislation, that you're still complying with that. You'll also receive unlimited access to your designated Code HR advisor, so we'll be able to guide you through the whole sickness absence process. You'll also receive access to the online web application that I showed you earlier, so that'll help you manage sickness, holiday, you'll be able to store documents on there, and there's lots of other things you can do within that system as well. There's also additional protection, employment protection cover available, and that includes costs and tribunals as well. So if you're not one of our Total members that have joined us today and you're interested in the service, please give us a call for a bespoke quote. Now, to make you aware of some upcoming events, I'm sure you all saw at the beginning of the presentation there was a poll available. So for the very last webinar in our current series, that's going to be held on the 4th of April, and we're giving you the opportunity to decide on the topic. So the topics are managing a redundancy process, and managing mental health in the workplace, and family-friendly rights. So that poll will shortly be reappearing. If you haven't already done so, please pop your vote into the box, and so we'll take that into consideration for the next webinar. We also have a compliance update event coming up. So that's in Birmingham on Friday the 3rd of May. Now you'll see on screen a link to our website. Have a look on our website for a few more details about that event as well. I've also mentioned a few times about some of our previous webinars that have been held. If you didn't get a chance to watch them, you potentially want to watch them again, log on to our website. They're all available on there. And this one again will also be available a bit later on. So have a look on our website and you'll be able to watch all of them there if you missed any of them.